The sledgehammer felt heavier than expected in Marcus's trembling hands as he stood before the pristine in-ground pool that had cost him 3 years of overtime shifts. Karen Whitmore's shrill voice still echoed in his ears. "This is MY property. Now, and I want that eyesore gone." But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Marcus had built more than just a pool in his backyard. He'd built a trap. And as the first swing of the hammer cracked the custom tile work, Marcus smiled for the first time in months, knowing that Karen's victory was about to become her downfall in the most spectacular way possible. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Willowbrook Estates as Marcus Chen loaded the last of his tools into the back of his pickup truck. His calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency, each piece of equipment finding its designated place, the same methodical precision that had built him a reputation as the neighborhood's most reliable contractor. "You sure about this, boss?" Tommy Ramirez asked, securing a top over the demolition equipment. At 19, Tommy still had the wide-eyed optimism that Marcus remembered having once, back when he believed hard work and honesty were enough to get by in this world. Marcus glanced back at the house that had been his sanctuary for 8 years, the modest 2-story colonial with the wraparound porch he'd rebuilt himself, the garden his late wife Elena had lovingly tended, and the crown jewel of the property, the kidney-shaped pool that sparkled like a sapphire in the morning light. "She wants it gone," Marcus said, his voice flat. "So we are taking it down." The pool had been Elena's dream. 3 years of saving every penny, working double shifts at the construction company, taking on weekend projects that left his back screaming and his hands bloody. But seeing her face light up that first summer when she'd cannonballed into the deep end, her laughter echoing off the water as she surfaced, hair plastered to her head like a mermaid, had made every sacrifice worth it. That was before the cancer, before the medical bills that ate through their savings like acid, before Elena's final request, "Promise me you'll keep swimming, Marcus. Promise me you won't let the pool become just another reminder of what we lost." He'd kept that promise for 2 years after her funeral. Every morning at dawn, he'd swim 50 laps, feeling Elena's presence in the rhythm of his strokes. The pool had become his church, his therapy, his lifeline to the woman who'd made his world make sense. "Mr. Chen." The voice made him turn. Karen Whitmore stood at the property line, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair catching the sunlight like spun gold. At 45, she had the kind of artificial beauty that money could buy, cosmetic enhancements that fought a losing battle against time and bitterness. Her lips, plumped with fillers, curved into what she probably thought was a sympathetic smile. "I know this must be difficult for you," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "But I want you to know that I'm not doing this to be cruel. It's just that property values in this neighborhood are dropping because of my pool." Marcus finished, having heard this speech 3 times already. "Right." Karen's expression hardened slightly. The HOA bylaws are very clear about maintaining property standards. And frankly, that pool is an eyesore. The tile is cracked, the deck needs resurfacing, and don't get me started on the safety concerns with that old diving board. Marcus bit back his first response. The tile had one hairline crack from the earthquake 2 months ago. The deck was perfectly maintained. He'd sealed it himself last spring. And the diving board was a vintage 1970s model that Elena had insisted on because it reminded her of her childhood home in Tucson. "The HOA gave you 60 days to bring it up to code," Karen continued. "That was 90 days ago." "I was waiting for the insurance settlement from the earthquake damage," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "The adjuster said, would. Could have." Karen waved her hand dismissively. "The fact remains, you're in violation. And as the new HOA president, I have a responsibility to all the residents of Willowbrook Estates." New president. That still stung. Karen had moved to the neighborhood only 6 months ago, buying the McMansion at the end of Maple Street with what Marcus suspected was divorce settlement money. Within weeks, she'd ingratiated herself with the board members, hosting wine tastings and book clubs, positioning herself as the solution to what she called the community's declining standards. Her first target had been the Martinez family's vegetable garden. Too unsightly. Then the Johnsons' basketball hoop. Street noise complaints. Now it was Marcus's pool. The demolition notice was legally served, Karen said, pulling a folded document from her designer purse. "You have until 5 p.m. today to begin removal, or the HOA will hire contractors and bill you for the work." Marcus took the paper, scanning the familiar legal jargon. He'd read it a dozen times, each word a nail in the coffin of his last connection to Elena. "There is one other option," Karen said, her voice taking on a different tone, softer, more intimate. She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her expensive perfume. "I've been thinking about putting in a pool myself. Something more contemporary. We could work out an arrangement." Marcus looked up from the notice. "What kind of arrangement?" Karen's smile widened. "You're handy. Good with your hands." Her fingers brushed against his forearm. "I could use someone reliable for the landscaping, the maintenance. Regular work, steady pay. And I'm sure we could find ways to make it mutually beneficial." The implication hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Marcus felt his stomach turn. This wasn't about property values or HOA bylaws. This was about power. About a woman who'd lost one life and was determined to control her new one by any means necessary. "And my pool would have to go, of course. But think of it as making room for something better. Something we could enjoy together." Marcus folded the notice carefully, slipping it into his shirt pocket. "I appreciate the offer, Mrs. Whitmore, but I'll stick with the original plan." Karen's expression shifted like a cloud passing over the sun. The fake warmth disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. "That's your choice," she said. "But don't come crying to me when the bills start piling up. Pool demolition isn't cheap, and I know your credit isn't exactly pristine after your wife's medical expenses." The words hit like a physical blow. Marcus's hands clenched into fists, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "How do you know about public records?" Karen said with a shrug. "It's amazing what you can find online these days. Bankruptcy filings, liens, credit reports. Did you know your mortgage is underwater by almost $40,000? That's got to be stressful." Marcus felt heat rising in his chest. "You had no right. I had every right to research my neighbors, especially ones who might drag down everyone else's property values." Karen stepped back, smoothing her tennis skirt. "Look, Marcus, can I call you Marcus? I'm trying to help you here. You're clearly in over your head financially. You need this work, and I need someone reliable. It's a win-win. And if I say no?" Karen's smile returned, but this time it was sharp as broken glass. "Then you demolish that pool by 5 o'clock, or I'll make sure the HOA pursues every legal remedy available, including foreclosure proceedings for unpaid fees." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Marcus? That earthquake damage you mentioned? I've done some research on that too. Seems like your homeowner's insurance has some very specific exclusions about acts of God and pre-existing structural issues. I'd hate for them to find out that pool was built without proper permits." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. The permits. He'd cut corners 8 years ago, desperate to save money, figuring no one would ever check. Elena had worried about it, but Marcus had assured her it would be fine. Just a little paperwork nobody cared about. "Have a good day," Karen called. Over her shoulder as she walked away, her heels clicking against the sidewalk like a countdown timer. Tommy appeared at Marcus's side. What was that about? Marcus watched Karen disappear into her house, already planning his next move. She thought. She held all the cards. She thought she knew everything about Marcus Chen, his debts, his desperation, his need to hold on to the last piece of Elena he had left. But Karen Whitmore had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated what a man would do when he had nothing left to lose. "Get the sledgehammer," Marcus said quietly. "Boss." Marcus turned toward his pool, Elena's pool, and for the first time in months, he smiled. A real smile, full of something that might have been anticipation. "She wants it down. By 5 o'clock, he said. "So we are going to take it down. All of it." Tommy frowned. "The whole thing? That's going to take days, maybe weeks. And what about the water? The electrical? Trust me," Marcus said, walking toward the shed where he kept his specialized tools. "I know exactly what I'm doing." As he pulled out the blueprints he'd kept filed away for 8 years, the real blueprints, not the simplified ones he'd submitted to the city, Marcus began to whistle. It was an old song Elena used to hum while she swam, something her grandmother had taught her in Mexico. Karen Whitmore thought she was getting a demolished pool and a broken man willing to do her bidding. What she was actually getting was something much more interesting. Something that would teach her the most important rule of Willowbrook Estates, BV. Custom Italian tile that had cost Marcus 2 months' salary. Tommy winced at the sound, like breaking bones, but Marcus felt only a strange sense of liberation as ceramic shards scattered into the chlorinated water below. "Easy, boss," Tommy said, adjusting his safety glasses. "Maybe we should drain it first? And what about the electrical for the pool lights? We should shut that off before." "Already done," Marcus said, wiping sweat from his forehead. He'd been up since 4 a.m., making preparations Tommy couldn't see. The main electrical panel, the water circulation system, even the gas line for the pool heater, everything was isolated and ready. Just keep the camera rolling. Tommy hefted the small digital camera Marcus had insisted he bring. "You sure about filming this? Seems kind of necessary," Marcus finished. "Trust me on this one, kid." The second swing opened a hole large enough to step through. Marcus set down the sledgehammer and pulled out a pry bar, working methodically to remove larger sections of tile. Each piece revealed more of what lay beneath, not the standard concrete and rebar of a typical pool construction, but something else entirely. "What the hell is that?" Tommy breathed, leaning closer. Embedded in the pool wall, now visible through the broken tile, was a thick sheet of transparent material. Not glass, something stronger, more flexible. And behind it, preserved like insects in amber, were dozens of documents sealed in waterproof containers. Marcus smiled grimly. "That, Tommy, is why I was never worried about Karen Whitmore's research skills." He continued working, each piece of removed tile revealing more of the hidden archive. 8 years ago, when Elena was still healthy and Marcus was still naive enough to believe the system would protect honest people, he discovered something that changed everything he thought he knew about Willowbrook Estates. "Boss, what are those papers?" "Insurance," Marcus said, prying away another section. "The kind you hope you'll never need, but you're damn glad to have when someone tries to destroy your life." The truth was, Marcus had never intended to build a secret compartment in his pool. It had started as a practical decision, the original. Excavation had hit an underground spring, and he'd needed to install additional waterproofing and drainage systems to prevent foundation damage. But then he'd found the box. It had been buried 3 feet down, wrapped in heavy plastic and duct tape. Inside were dozens of files, photographs, and financial records dating back 15 years. At first, Marcus had assumed it was just garbage, left by a previous construction crew. But when he'd started reading, he'd realized he was holding something much more valuable than trash. Evidence. Enough evidence to bring down half the city council, 3 judges, and the entire Willowbrook Estates Development Corporation. "Jesus," Tommy whispered, watching Marcus carefully extract the first sealed container. "How long has this been here?" "Long enough," Marcus said. He cracked open the waterproof seal and pulled out a thick manila folder. The papers inside were pristine, protected from 8 years of water and weather. Long enough for people to get comfortable. Long enough for them to forget that somebody, somewhere, might be keeping records. The first document was a copy of a building permit, the real one, not the falsified version that had been filed with the city. It showed that Willowbrook Estates had been built on contaminated land, a former chemical storage facility that should never have been approved for residential development. The signature at the bottom belonged to Judge Patricia Henley, the same judge who'd rubber-stamped every HOA lawsuit for the past decade. The second document was even better, a receipt for a $50,000 cash payment to Judge Henley, signed by Richard Blackstone, the developer who'd built Willowbrook Estates. The memo line read, "Zoning consultation." But it was the photograph that made Tommy's eyes widen. Judge Henley and Blackstone at what appeared to be a private party, Henley laughing as Blackstone handed her an envelope thick with cash. "Holy shit," Tommy breathed. "Is that the judge who's been approving every HOA foreclosure in this neighborhood for the past 10 years, Marcus finished. "Including the one Karen Whitmore is threatening me with." Marcus had spent weeks after Elena's funeral going through every document in the collection, cross-referencing names and dates, building a complete picture of the corruption that had made Willowbrook Estates possible. Bribes, falsified environmental reports, safety inspections that had never happened, building codes that had been systematically ignored. And at the center of it all, like a spider in a web, was the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. The HOA wasn't just complicit, Marcus explained, opening another container. It was the whole point. A legal framework for forcing out residents who asked too many questions, driving down property values so the original investors could buy back the land cheap and redevelop it. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. Target a homeowner with arbitrary rule violations. Pile on legal fees until they couldn't afford to fight. Force a foreclosure. Buy the property through shell companies at a fraction of its value. Rinse and repeat until you own the entire neighborhood. But why hide this stuff in your pool? Tommy asked. Marcus pulled out a newspaper clipping from 2017. The headline read, "Local contractor dies in suspicious fire." The photo showed a burnt-out house, nothing left but blackened timbers and ash. Because the last guy who tried to expose this ended up dead, Marcus said quietly. Jerry Morrison. He'd found some of the same documents I did. Started asking questions about soil contamination, about why so many long-time residents were suddenly having financial difficulties that forced them to sell. Tommy read over Marcus's shoulder. According to the article, Morrison had died when an electrical fire started in his home workshop. The fire department had ruled it accidental, faulty wiring in an old building. But Marcus knew better. Morrison was the best electrician in the county, Marcus continued. He would never have had faulty wiring. But he made the mistake of keeping his evidence in a fireproof safe in his house. Easy to find, easier to destroy. Marcus had learned from Morrison's mistake. Instead of hiding the documents somewhere they could be stolen or destroyed, he'd built them into the structure of his home. Protected by water, sealed against time, impossible to remove without demolishing the pool itself. So when Karen threatened to force demolition, Tommy was beginning to understand. She was threatening to expose the very thing that could destroy her, Marcus finished. The HOA, the judges, the whole corrupt system that's been bleeding this neighborhood dry for 15 years. Marcus opened the next container and felt his pulse quicken. Inside was the document he'd been looking for, a detailed financial analysis showing how the HOA had been systematically targeting specific homeowners based on their race, age, and economic status. Elderly residents who might need expensive medical care, minorities who might organize politically, working-class families who couldn't afford prolonged legal battles. The pattern was clear, documented, and absolutely illegal under federal fair housing laws. But there's more, Marcus said, his voice taking on a harder edge. He pulled out a photograph that made Tommy gasp. It showed Karen Whitmore, not the Karen who'd moved to Willowbrook 6 months ago, but a younger version from 15 years earlier. She was standing next to Richard Blackstone at what appeared to be a construction site, both of them smiling at the camera. The caption on the back read, K. Whitmore Blackstone and R. Blackstone, Willowbrook Estates groundbreaking, 2010. Whitmore Blackstone, Tommy read aloud. She's married to the developer. Was married, Marcus corrected. Divorced 3 years ago, according to public records. But the timing is interesting, don't you think? She moves back to Willowbrook just as the final phase of property acquisition was supposed to begin. Marcus had spent the past month researching Karen's background, using the same public records she'd thrown in his face. Karen Whitmore wasn't just some wealthy divorcee looking for a quiet place to rebuild her life. She was Richard Blackstone's ex-wife, a woman who knew every detail of the scheme that had been slowly strangling Willowbrook Estates for over a decade. And now she was back to finish the job. She played me perfectly, Marcus admitted, carefully sealing the documents back in their containers. Made me think this was about petty HOA politics and property values. But she's been planning this for months. Target the most vulnerable remaining homeowner, force a crisis, then offer a solution that puts her in the perfect position to complete the final acquisition phase. So what do we do? Tommy asked. Marcus stood up, brushing concrete dust from his hands. Around them, the pool looked like a crime scene, broken tile, exposed walls, the hidden archive partially revealed like secrets bleeding from a wound. We finish what we started, Marcus said, but not the way Karen expects. He walked to his truck and pulled out a large waterproof case, the kind used by professional photographers. Inside, nestled in foam padding, were copies of every document from the pool archive, along with a detailed analysis Marcus had spent 2 years preparing. Tommy, I need you to drive this to the FBI field office in downtown LA, Marcus said. Ask for Agent Sarah Chen, no relation, different spelling. She specializes in public corruption cases. What about you? Marcus looked back at the pool, then at Karen's house where a curtain twitched in an upstairs window. She was. Karen Whitmore stood at her kitchen window, watching Marcus Chen destroy his pool with the methodical precision of a man dismantling his own life. The sledgehammer rose and fell in steady rhythm, each impact sending shockwaves through the crystal clear water that had once been his sanctuary. Perfect. She lifted her phone and dialed a familiar number. Richard answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the casual arrogance that had once attracted her and now made her skin crawl. Is it done? He asked without preamble. Almost, Karen said, unable to keep the satisfaction from her voice. He's tearing it down as we speak. Broke him faster than we expected. Good. The sooner we can move to final acquisition, the better. The environmental cleanup costs are escalating every month we delay. Karen watched Marcus pause to wipe sweat from his forehead, his shoulders sagging with what looked like defeat. 3 months of psychological warfare, the manufactured HOA violations, the financial pressure, the carefully orchestrated isolation from his neighbors, had finally broken the man who'd once seemed unshakable. What about the Martinez family? Richard asked. And the Johnsons? Already in motion, Karen replied. Elena Martinez got a notice about her vegetable garden yesterday. Property maintenance violations. The Johnsons will get hit next week for the basketball hoop noise complaints. I've documented dozens of calls from concerned neighbors. And if they fight it? Karen smiled coldly. They won't. Not once they see what happened to Marcus. Nothing. Teaches compliance like a good example. She'd learned the psychology of neighborhood control from Richard during their marriage. How to isolate targets, create false scarcity, make resistance seem futile. The HOA was just a tool, but in the right hands, it was more effective than any weapon. How many properties do we need for final phase? She asked. 12 more, Richard said. Then we own enough of the neighborhood to petition for commercial. Rezoning. The tech company is already pre-approved for the campus development. We are looking at a 400% return on investment. 400%. Karen did the math in her head. Her divorce settlement had bought her a 40% stake in the Willowbrook acquisition project. When the neighborhood was demolished and rebuilt as a corporate campus, she'd clear $12 million. Enough to disappear forever, maybe to somewhere without extradition treaties. There's one complication, she said, watching Marcus carefully extract something from the broken pool wall. Chen's been more thorough with the demolition than expected. He's practically excavating the entire structure. So I'm wondering if there's anything we should be worried about. You said the previous owner of that lot was problematic. There was a long pause. Jerry Morrison was an electrician. He asked too many questions about soil contamination, tried to organize some of the other homeowners. But that was handled years ago. Handled. Karen knew what that meant. Richard had always been careful with his language, even during their most intimate conversations. Especially then. Morrison's house burned down before he could cause real problems, Richard continued. Everything he had was destroyed in the fire. There's nothing left to find. But Karen wasn't so sure. She'd been watching Marcus for months, studying his patterns, his reactions. The man who was systematically destroying his pool wasn't behaving like someone who'd been broken. There was something almost methodical about his movements. Purposeful. I'm going over there, she decided. I want to supervise the final stages personally. Karen, that's not necessary. You've done your job. Let the man destroy his pool in peace and then what? He becomes our landscaper? Our maintenance man. Karen's voice sharpened. Richard, I know men like Marcus Chen. They don't break easily, and when they do, they don't stay broken. I want to make sure there are no surprises. She hung up before he could respond. Richard had always underestimated people, assuming money and power were enough to control any situation. It was why their marriage had failed, why their business partnership would fail too, once she'd secured her share of the profits. But first, she needed to make sure Marcus Chen wasn't hiding any unpleasant surprises in that pool of his. Karen, changed into designer jeans and a cashmere sweater, casual enough to seem neighborly, expensive enough to remind Marcus of the class difference between them. She grabbed a bottle of expensive wine from her collection and headed across the street. Marcus looked up as she approached, his face streaked with sweat and concrete dust. The pool was barely recognizable now, the decorative tilework completely destroyed, the smooth curves of the design reduced to jagged concrete and exposed rebar. "Thought you might need some refreshment," Karen said, holding up the wine. "This is hard work." "Mrs. Whitmore." Marcus straightened, setting down his sledgehammer. "I thought you'd want to stay away until the job was finished." "Call me Karen," she said, moving closer to examine the destruction. "And I have to admit, I'm curious. I've never seen a pool demolished before." She walked around the perimeter, noting the unusual depth of the excavation. Marcus hadn't just removed the tile and surface concrete. He'd dug down to the original foundation, exposing layers of construction that should have been left untouched. "This seems like more work than necessary," she observed. "I thought you were just removing the pool, not excavating the entire structure." Marcus wiped his hands on a towel, his expression unreadable. "The earthquake damage was more extensive than I realized. Structural cracks all the way down to the foundation. Better to rebuild from scratch than patch a compromised system." "Rebuild?" Karen felt a flicker of alarm. "I thought we'd discussed this. The new owner won't want a pool." "The new owner?" "Well, yes." Karen felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd spoken without thinking, revealed too much too soon. "I mean, when you eventually sell. Given your financial situation, I assumed." Marcus was studying her face with uncomfortable intensity. "You seem very interested in my property value, Mrs. Whitmore. Is there something you'd like to tell me?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Karen felt a sudden urge to step back, to put distance between herself and this man, who was looking at her like he could see through her carefully constructed facade. "I'm just trying to be a good neighbor," she said, forcing a smile. "And please, call me Karen. We are going to be working together, after all." "About that," Marcus said. "I've been thinking about your offer. The landscaping work, the maintenance, contracts. It's generous. But I'm curious about the timing. You've been in the neighborhood, 6 months? And already you're planning major renovations, talking about property values, making business offers to neighbors you barely know." Marcus moved closer, and Karen caught the scent of sweat and concrete dust. Most people take longer to settle in before they start changing everything around them. Karen felt her pulse quicken. There was something predatory in Marcus's tone, something that reminded her uncomfortably of Richard during their most vicious arguments. "I'm a planner," she said. "I like to know what my future looks like." "So do I," Marcus said. "Which is why I did some research of my own." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. Karen's breath caught as she recognized the letterhead, Riverside County Clerk's Office. "Marriage and divorce records." "Interesting reading," Marcus continued. "Karen Elizabeth Whitmore, formerly Karen Elizabeth Blackstone. Married to Richard James Blackstone in 2008. Divorced in 2022. Settlement included substantial assets from Blackstone Development Corporation." Karen's mind raced. The records were public, but the fact that Marcus had bothered to look them up meant he suspected something. The question was how much he'd pieced together. "My ex-husband is a successful developer," she said carefully. "I don't see how that's relevant to our neighborly arrangement." "Blackstone Development Corporation," Marcus repeated. "The company that built Willowbrook Estates." The words hit like physical blows. Karen felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Marcus said. "I'm stating facts. Your ex-husband built this neighborhood. You moved back here 6 months ago. You became HOA president within weeks of arriving. You immediately began targeting longtime residents with manufactured violations. Those violations are legitimate, are they?" Marcus pulled out another document. This one Karen didn't recognize. Some kind of technical report with official-looking seals and signatures. Because according to this environmental impact study, Willowbrook Estates was built on contaminated soil that should never have been approved for residential development. Karen felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Where did you get that?" "Same place I got these," Marcus said, producing a thick folder. building permits that don't match the filed plans, safety inspections that were never conducted, zoning variances that were approved without proper review. He opened the folder, and Karen saw photographs that made her stomach drop. Richard, at various construction sites, shaking hands with city officials, envelopes changing hands in restaurant parking lots. "How long have you had these?" she whispered. "Long enough," Marcus said. "Long enough to understand exactly what you and Richard have been doing to this neighborhood. Long enough to document the pattern of targeted harassment, illegal foreclosures, and systematic displacement of resident. The Willowbrook Estates Community Center hadn't seen this many residents in years. By 7:45 p.m., every folding chair was occupied, with overflow crowds standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. Word had spread through the neighborhood. Like wildfire, emergency HOA meeting, important announcements about property values and neighborhood safety. Marcus arrived early, positioning himself in the back corner where he could observe everyone who entered. He'd changed into his best suit. The navy blue one Elena had bought him for their anniversary 3 years ago. If tonight went according to plan, it would be the most important presentation of his life. The evidence was ready. Multiple copies of every document, organized in chronological order, with summaries that even non-lawyers could understand. Tommy had delivered the originals to Agent Chen as instructed, but Marcus had kept enough to tell the complete story. Karen entered at exactly 8 p.m., her usual confident stride replaced by something more cautious. She'd changed clothes 3 times, settling on a conservative black dress that made her look like she was attending a funeral. Which, in a way, she was. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Marcus nodded slightly, a reminder of the choice she had to make. Karen's jaw tightened, but she looked away and took her seat at the front table. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Karen began, her voice carrying the manufactured warmth Marcus had learned to recognize as manipulation. "I know many of you are concerned about recent changes in our neighborhood, and I want to address those concerns directly." Mrs. Martinez raised her hand. "Is this about the garden violations? Because I've been growing vegetables in my backyard for 20 years, and suddenly it's a problem." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Marcus watched Karen's face carefully, looking for signs of which direction she'd chosen. "Mrs. Martinez, your garden is just one of several property maintenance issues we've identified," Karen said. "As HOA president, I have a responsibility to maintain community standards that protect everyone's property values." The wrong choice. Marcus felt a mixture of disappointment and anticipation. Karen was going to fight this to the end, which meant he got to destroy her publicly. "Speaking of property values," said Jim Johnson from the middle of the room, "what's this I hear about? Marcus Chen being forced to demolish his pool? That pool was beautiful. My kids learned to swim in that pool." "Mr. Chen's pool was in violation of several safety codes," Karen replied. "The HOA gave him ample opportunity to bring it into compliance, but that's not true," Marcus said, standing up. Every head in the room turned toward him. "And I think it's time everyone knew what's really been happening in our neighborhood." Karen's face went pale. "Mr. Chen, this isn't the appropriate forum for personal grievances. Sit down, Karen." Marcus said quietly. The use of her first name, without the formal Mrs. Whitmore, sent a clear message. The polite facades were over. Marcus walked to the front of the room, carrying a thick folder. "How many of you have received HOA violations in the past year? Raise your hands." Nearly half the room raised their hands. How many of those violations seemed arbitrary, targeting things that had never been problems before? The same hands stayed up, with a few more joining them. And how many of you noticed that the violations always seemed to target families who'd lived here the longest? People who knew the neighborhood's history? The murmur grew louder. Marcus saw recognition, dawning on several faces. "Mr. Chen," Karen said, standing up, "I don't know what you're trying to imply, but this meeting was called to discuss legitimate community concerns, not conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories." Marcus opened his folder and pulled out the first photograph. "Is this a conspiracy theory?" He held up the image of Judge Patricia Henley accepting an envelope of cash from Richard Blackstone. The room fell silent. "This photograph shows Judge Henley, who has approved every HOA foreclosure in this neighborhood for the past decade, accepting a bribe from Richard Blackstone, the developer who built Willowbrook Estates." "That's impossible," someone called out. Judge Henley is completely honest. She's been on the bench for 15 years. She has, Marcus agreed. And for 15 years, she's been taking money to rubber stamp fraudulent legal proceedings designed to steal your homes. He pulled out the next document. This is a copy of the original environmental impact study for Willowbrook Estates. It shows that this neighborhood was built on contaminated soil from a former chemical storage facility. The contamination was covered up, and families have been living on poisoned ground for over a decade. The room erupted. Voices rose in anger, confusion, fear. Marcus saw Maria Martinez clutch her husband's arm, thinking about their 3 young children who played in the supposedly safe backyard soil every day. These are lies. Karen shouted over the noise. Mr. Chen is clearly having some kind of breakdown after his wife's death. These documents could be fabricated, could they? Marcus pulled out his phone and activated the speaker. Let's ask someone who would know. Agent Sarah Chen's voice filled the room, crisp and professional. This is Special Agent Chen, FBI Public Corruption Unit. At approximately 2:30 p.m. today, we received a comprehensive package of evidence documenting systematic fraud, bribery, and violations of federal fair housing laws in the Willowbrook Estates development. The room went dead silent. The evidence includes financial records, photographs, environmental reports, and recorded conversations that establish a pattern of criminal conspiracy spanning 15 years. We have opened a full investigation into these allegations. Marcus ended the call and looked directly at Karen. Her face had gone from pale to grey, and she was gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were white. You want to know what's really been happening here? Marcus continued. Karen Whitmore isn't just your HOA president. She's Karen Blackstone, ex-wife of the developer who built this neighborhood on contaminated land with fraudulent permits. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Residents turned to stare at Karen, who seemed to shrink under their collective gaze. She moved back here 6 months ago with one goal: to force out the remaining original residents so her ex-husband could complete his acquisition of the neighborhood. They planned to demolish everything and build a corporate campus, making millions, while leaving you with nothing. That's not true, Karen said, but her voice was barely a whisper. Marcus pulled out another photograph. This shows Jerry Morrison, the electrician who used to live in my house. He discovered evidence of the contamination and tried to warn people. 3 days later, his house burned down and he was dead. Maria Martinez gasped. Jerry Morrison was murdered. The fire was ruled accidental, Marcus said. But Jerry was the best electrician in the county. He would never have had faulty wiring. And conveniently, all his evidence was destroyed in the fire. He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many residents as possible. Jerry made one mistake. He kept his evidence where it could be found and destroyed. I didn't make that mistake. Marcus gestured toward Karen. She forced me to demolish my pool today, thinking she was breaking my last connection to my late wife. What she actually did was force me to excavate 8 years' worth of evidence that I'd hidden in the pool's construction. Evidence of what? Jim Johnson demanded. Marcus pulled out the thick manila folder that contained the heart of his case. Evidence that Judge Henley has been taking bribes to approve illegal foreclosures. Evidence that the HOA has been systematically targeting minority and elderly residents. Evidence that this entire neighborhood is built on poison ground, and that everyone responsible has been covering it up for 15 years. He turned to face Karen directly. Evidence that includes recorded conversations with Mrs. Blackstone. Here, where she admits to the conspiracy and threatens federal witnesses. Karen finally found her voice. You can't prove any of this. Those recordings were made illegally. In California, only one party needs to consent to recording, Marcus said. I consented. And since you were on my property, discussing your criminal conspiracy, every word is admissible in court. The room exploded again, but this time the anger was directed at Karen. Residents who had been targeted with violations surrounded her table, voices raised in accusation and betrayal. My grandmother got evicted because of you, someone shouted. My family had to sell because of the legal fees. How many people have you destroyed? Karen looked around frantically, searching for an escape route, but the crowd had surrounded her completely. Marcus almost felt sorry for her. Almost. There's more, Marcus said, and the room quieted again. The contamination isn't just in the soil. It's in the groundwater too. Everyone who's been drinking from their taps, watering their gardens, filling their pools, you've been exposed to industrial chemicals for over a decade. Maria Martinez stood up, tears streaming down her face. My daughter has leukemia. She's 8 years old. The doctors said they couldn't find a cause. The room went silent again, the weight of that revelation settling over everyone like a shroud. Marcus felt his own eyes burn. This was why he'd kept the evidence for 8 years. This was why Elena had made him promise to fight when the time came. Not for revenge, but for justice. For families like the Martinezes who deserve to know WH. Richard Blackstone's penthouse office commanded a panoramic view of downtown Los Angeles, 40 stories above the city he'd spent decades learning to manipulate. The morning sun caught the glass surfaces of his awards and commendations. Developer of the Year, Environmental Leadership Award, Outstanding Community Service, each one a testament to his ability to buy respectability along with everything else. He was reviewing acquisition reports when his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Mr. Blackstone? There are some federal agents here to see you. They don't have an appointment. Richard felt his blood pressure spike. What kind of federal agents? FBI, sir. They're asking about something called the Willowbrook Estates investigation. The pen in Richard's hand snapped. Ink spread across the quarterly projections like blood on snow. Karen had sworn this would never happen. The evidence was destroyed, the witnesses silenced, the paper trail scrubbed clean 15 years ago. Send them in, he said, activating the recording system built into his desk. If the FBI wanted to play games, he'd make sure he had insurance. Agent Sarah Chen entered first, followed by 2 other agents Richard didn't recognize. She was younger than he'd expected, with the kind of quiet intensity that reminded him uncomfortably of prosecutors who couldn't be bought. Mr. Blackstone, Agent Chen said, settling into the chair across from his desk without waiting for an invitation. Thank you for seeing us without a warrant. Though I should mention, we have one being prepared if needed. I'm always happy to cooperate with law enforcement, Richard said, shifting into the persona that had served him for decades, the successful businessman with nothing to hide. What can I do for you? Agent Chen opened a thick folder. We're investigating allegations of fraud, bribery, and federal civil rights violations related to the Willowbrook Estates development. Your name has come up quite frequently. Richard forced himself to smile. Willowbrook was one of my first major projects. 15 years ago now. I'm not sure how much I can remember about the specifics. Let me help refresh your memory, Agent Chen said, sliding a photograph across the desk. Richard's breath caught. It was the picture from the groundbreaking ceremony, him shaking hands with Judge Henley while an envelope visibly changed hands. Between them, the photo was crystal clear, professionally shot, impossible to deny. This is you and Judge Patricia Henley at the Willowbrook Estates groundbreaking in 2010, Agent Chen said. The envelope contains $50,000 in cash. Judge Henley has already confirmed this in her statement to us. The room seemed to tilt. Patricia gave you a statement. Judge Henley was arrested at her home at 6 a.m. this morning, Agent Chen said. Faced with 23 felony counts and the possibility of life in prison, she's been very cooperative, very detailed in her recollections. Richard felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. Patricia Henley had been his insurance policy, the one person who could make any legal challenge disappear. If she was talking, I want my lawyer, he said. Of course. But first, let me show you what else we have. Agent Chen pulled out another document. This is an environmental impact study conducted by Pacific Environmental Services in 2009. It shows dangerous levels of chemical contamination in the soil where you built Willowbrook Estates. Richard glanced at the report, his mind racing. Pacific Environmental had been paid very well to lose that study. Their silence had cost him $200,000. I've never seen this document, he lied. Interesting, Agent Chen said. Because Pacific Environmental kept very detailed records of their communications with your company, including this email where you instructed them to bury the environmental concerns and focus on development opportunities. She slid another paper across the desk. Richard saw his own words staring back at him. The contamination is manageable if we Keep quiet about it. No point in spooking potential buyers with technical details they won't understand. That email was taken out of context, Richard said. Environmental remediation is complex. You were simply covering up the fact that you knowingly built homes on poison ground, Agent Chen interrupted. Ground that has since caused dozens of cases of cancer, birth defects, and other serious health problems. She pulled out a medical report. Maria Martinez, age 8, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Diagnosed 18 months ago. She's lived in Willowbrook. Estates her entire life, drinking contaminated water and playing in contaminated soil. Richard looked at the photo paperclipped to the report. A beautiful little girl with huge brown eyes and a radiant smile. The kind of child Elena would have cooed over. The kind Karen claimed to want before she decided money was more important than family. I'm sorry to hear about the child's illness, Richard said carefully. But correlation isn't causation. There could be many factors. There are 17 confirmed cases of cancer in a neighborhood of 43 families, Agent Chen said. The statistical probability of that occurring naturally is less than 1 in 10 million. She leaned forward. But the environmental contamination is just the beginning, Mr. Blackstone. Let's talk about the systematic targeting of minority families for fraudulent foreclosures. Another folder appeared on the desk. This one contained photos Richard recognized with growing horror, surveillance shots of him meeting with various HOA board members over the years, envelopes changing hands, documents being signed in restaurant. Back rooms. Federal fair housing laws are very clear about discriminatory practices, Agent Chen continued. Targeting families based on race, age, or economic status is a felony. And you left quite a paper trail. Richard's mouth was dry. I think there's been a misunderstanding. The HOA operates independently, does it? Agent Chen pulled out a bank statement. This shows regular payments from Blackstone Development to something called Community Standards Consulting. Want to guess what that turns out to be? Richard didn't need to guess. He'd set up the shell company himself, a way to funnel money to HOA board members without leaving obvious tracks. We've trace payments totaling over $3 million over the past 10 years, Agent Chen said, all connected to specific foreclosure actions against families who'd lived in Willowbrook for more than 5 years. That's business consulting. Perfectly legal. Is murder for hire also perfectly legal? Agent Chen asked quietly. The question hit Richard like ice water. What? Jerry Morrison, the electrician who discovered evidence of your fraud and tried to warn other residents. He died in a convenient house fire just days before he was scheduled to meet with environmental investigators. Agent Chen placed a new photograph on the desk. It showed Richard shaking hands with a man Richard had hoped never to see again, Vincent Torres, the arsonist who'd made Jerry Morrison's problems disappear forever. Mr. Torres was arrested in Phoenix 2 days ago on unrelated charges, Agent Chen said. Faced with a life sentence, he's been remarkably forthcoming about his previous work, including a job in 2017 where he was paid $50,000 to stage an electrical fire. Richard felt the walls closing in. Vincent Torres was supposed to be untouchable, a professional who never left evidence. But professionals got sloppy when they thought they were untouchable. I've never met that man, Richard said, but his voice cracked on the words. Really? Because we have security footage of you meeting with him 3 times in the weeks before Jerry Morrison's death. We also have bank records showing a cash withdrawal of exactly $50,000 from your personal account 2 days before the fire. Agent Chen pulled out one final document, but the most interesting evidence came from an unexpected source. Marcus Chen. Richard's head snapped up. Marcus Chen, Elena's husband. You know him. His wife died of cancer. I sent flowers to the funeral. Richard caught himself too late. He wasn't supposed to know about Elena's death unless you'd been monitoring the neighborhood residents to identify potential problems, Agent Chen finished. Like you monitored Jerry Morrison before you had him killed. She opened the final folder. Mr. Chen spent 8 years collecting evidence of your crimes, financial records, photographs, environmental reports, recordings of conversations with your ex-wife Karen. He built an incredibly detailed case, then had the patience to wait for the right moment to use it. Richard stared at the photograph spread across his desk, 15 years of corruption laid out like a timeline of his life. Every bribe, every cover-up, every life destroyed in pursuit of profit. The demolition of his pool yesterday exposed. A cache of evidence that your ex-wife inadvertently forced him to reveal, Agent Chen continued. She thought she was breaking him. Instead, she gave him exactly the opening he needed to bring down your entire operation. Karen was never supposed to go back there, Richard said, then caught himself again. Another admission, another nail. In his coffin. No, she wasn't, Agent Chen agreed. Because you knew that Marcus Chen was dangerous. You knew he had evidence. But you couldn't resist the chance to acquire those final 12 properties for the tech campus development. She pulled out architectural plans, Richard's own designs for the corporate campus that would replace Willowbrook Estates. 400% return on investment. $12 million for Karen, $40 million for you. Worth the risk of a few more years.